we kicked off the year, the beginning of the pandemic, organizing a phone call that would basically that comprised essentially at that point that we called the DC Jazz stakeholders to examine what the relief efforts were going to look like amongst the scene, so that there wasn't too much overlap or musicians were missing out on available funding or support in that way. And we were, as Aaron mentioned, we were the first to jump out there to offer micro grants to 2 rounds of micro grants to DC-based jazz musicians. And it was kind of, my position. I'm the founder of the Capitol Hill Jazz Foundation, and it's always been my position. I'm a native Washingtonian that DC jazz musicians and the surrounding musicians need as much support in terms of grant funding. One of the reasons why I started the foundation was that when jazz musicians were applying for grants in Washington, D.C., they often had to compete against the other performing arts groups, and then separately against the other music genre art forms. And I thought that jazz deserved its own kind of space to be recognized and supported in that way. And so our efforts for the past 5 years have involved us engaging the city council on various issues to not only maintain that the support for the nonprofit sector of jazz or music and arts and culture in Washington, D.C. through the Commission on the Arts and Humanities, but also the for-profit sector with the Office of Cable Television, Film and Music and Entertainment, to ensure that there's other performance opportunities and other grants for individuals and organizations as well. And so throughout the year, that call shifted to more of an advocacy kind of related call, where we, the foundation, to basically kind of make things very, very clear as I talk here, is very focused on 3 kind of segments, which are the music community, which are musicians, venues, and music education programs. And so that's kind of how we separate and delineate where we're going to focus our efforts. And so we began with the musicians, then we realized quickly thereafter that music venues, we wanted to preserve them, that when we came out on the other side of this pandemic and things were reopened, that we would essentially be able to reopen back to a scene. And so we helped draft a piece of legislation entitled the Music Venue Relief Act. And we really pushed the mayor of Washington to really observe that and try to get some support behind that. Thankfully, that particular bill was not introduced. However, there was a kind of an overall kind of a bill that supported the gig workers in Washington, D.C. And so there were musicians and some venues that were able to benefit from that. Prior to the pandemic, we were successful at helping to draft the Performing Arts Promotion Amendment of 2019, which provides up to $15,000 in a property tax rebate for small music venues here in Washington, D.C. And so we're very grateful that there have been a few venues in D.C. that have taken advantage of that that provision and have actually received their money. Another thing that Aaron mentioned is the Jazz Caucus, our national efforts to preserve jazz, promote jazz nationally. And we're happy to mention that Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, who we're still waiting for the recertification of that caucus. But she did reintroduce the Jazz Preservation Bill, which I'm going to put in the YouTube chat here. It's HR 139. It's the new bill reintroduced into this Congress that calls for the preservation of jazz institutions and things. For those of you that are familiar with HR 57, which was the original kind of jazz preservation bill entered back in the day. But, jazz, and we all know this, and music, and just in general, is a bipartisan issue. So part of the effort of getting support around any jazz-related issues or music-related issues is, one, identifying the uniqueness of jazz versus the other music caucuses out there, and getting support from members to join that caucus from both sides of the aisle. So as we move through this Congress, we don't know. I mean, unfortunately, our co-chair, well, fortunately, I don't know depends on how you look at it, Doug Collins from Georgia no longer has that seat in Georgia. But when that caucus was introduced, it was really nominal to see that these completely polar opposite members of Congress, Sheila Jackson Lee and Doug Collins, were co-chairing a jazz caucus in Congress. So we're continually looking at other ways that we can move that caucus along. Sheila Jackson Lee's office, that has been very supportive of us, but there's been a lot of turnover within her ranks, and so we're just kind of continuing to keep abreast of that that thing. The other side of issues that we focus on here in Washington D.C. is just making sure that not only that the council recognizes the beauty of the music, but that there's not efforts to thwart the performances of music. And so 2 years ago, there was a bill introduced called the Amplified Noise Amendment that would call for the fine and arrest of musicians who perform too loudly. We advocated very, 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 very aggressively against that bill, and it was rescinded. But there were efforts to reintroduce that bill during a pandemic because musicians were looking to, without anywhere to play, cats go outside and play in the park and different things. And so we've been working on in other ways, instead of over policing the musicians, looking at ways to designate those particular problem areas as arts areas and arts districts and that sort of thing. So we worked on another piece of legislation that is being introduced called Harmonious Living, which there's a bunch of different elements of that, but part of that is basically kind of an agreement between developers and residents that move and live in a known historic entertainment district. That it's kind of like a treaty in a sense, that you will acknowledge that this space has been historically designated as a entertainment commercial space, and that's where you're living now. Also, a provision for those developers or property managers or whatever that want to insulate their spaces so that they can they would receive a rebate in order to shield themselves from the music there. So we're kind of working on both ends of that that issue there. The other thing that I've been trying to inspire, the other element that we've been kind of rallying musicians around is that, once the election happened, we had a it was hashtag Save DC Music Venues effort, where we had a citywide concert. We looked for as many different groups, individuals, bands to perform at different spots all throughout Washington, D.C. to send a message to the mayor that we need support to save our DC music venues. And then on the election day, we had musicians perform at polling stations to remind voters that they should keep in mind to vote for candidates that support the arts, jazz, and culture. And that was our kind of swing the vote campaign. And we did that. We had a performance at the Supreme Court as well. So we've done a lot of nominal things, a lot of kind of, in addition to the relief and the bills, we've done things to kind of rally the musicians to kind of keep the spirit up. We're currently celebrating a Jazz Appreciation Month with a bunch of daily things, and I personally want to say I'm really grateful and honored to be included with this stellar group of people. I didn't even know I was nominated, so the whole thing's a shock to me. But thank you so much for having me.